My name is Dane Coleman. I'll be presenting on the UCLA Child and Adolescent PTSD Reaction Index using the DSM-5. What is the University of California at Los Angeles Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Reaction Index? The University of California Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Reaction Index is one of the most widely used instruments for the assessment of traumatized children and adolescents. It has been used around the world after major disasters and catastrophic violence as an integral component of the public mental health response and recovery programs. PTSD at the center of it all. These are some things that are attached to PTSD. So you have with the PTSD, you may have also low self-esteem, start to get blamed. The child may have heightened sense of danger, insomnia, not being able to sleep. So these are things that are attached to the PTSD once you're diagnosed as PTSD for a child and adolescent. So things that come with it: having nightmares, suicidal thoughts, rage. The widespread prevalence of childhood trauma exposure and associated risk for PTSD underscores the need for reliable and valid measures for the youth. The UCLA PTSD Reaction Index is one of the most widely used tools to assess post-traumatic stress reactions and predict PTSD diagnostic status in trauma-exposed children and adolescents. The criteria, the DSM-5 criteria for PTSD is A, exposure to the actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence in one or more of the following ways. One, directly experiencing the traumatic event. Two is also witnessing, so if you witnessed in-person event as it occurred to others, or they may have learned that the traumatic event occurred to a close family member or friend. In cases of actual or threatened death of family members or friend, the events must have been violent or accidental, or they may have experienced repeated or extreme exposures to adverse details of the traumatic event. So an example would be the first responders collecting human remains, or police officer repeatedly exposed the details of child abuse. This is a criteria that we back to the criteria here. When speaking of the individuals directly experiencing the traumatic event, but this does not apply to the individual exposure through electronic media, television, movies, or pictures unless this exposure is work-related. Presence of one of these following intrusion symptoms associated with the traumatic events beginning after the traumatic events have occurred. The second is recurrent, involuntary, or intrusive distressing memories of the event. Repetitive play with trauma themes. So for an example, I work at Children's Hospital and I work in the psych department. So we get a lot of children and adolescents that come in with a diagnosis of PTSD, and you'll start seeing some of this play when they have this play with others or with them, with themselves, where they're imaginary playing with the traumatic events that they have seen in their lives. Example would be when they're playing with toys. A lot of times you see the kids kind of going through the motions of, well, this is the father, this is the kid, and they'll maybe scream at the other spouse, or maybe hit the kid and say, start yelling and screaming at them during their play. And so they're, they could be actually, replaying this play with the traumatic events that they experienced. So this is kind of what I see at the hospital, with kids that have the diagnosis of PTSD with this repetitive play with these themes. Third, the reoccurring distressing dreams related to the event. They may have frightening dreams without recon- recognizable content, dissociative reactions, flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts as if they were reoccurring. Trauma-specific reenactment may occur in play. That's what we're talking about. Also talking about that reenactment that occurs in play with the dolls, but also this reenactment may be in play, with an adult. I've been playing with the kids, and not just, when they're playing with the toys. I may be, playing with them, and they're having this imaginary play, telling me to pretend to be, their dad, and ask me questions like, "Will you yell at me? Will you do this?" And I'm like, I'm trying to teach the child in that moment, like, I'm not going to yell at you, but realizing that this is the traumatic play that they're reenacting, that they're occurring. This is what they use. This is what they've seen. So they're reenacting some play that may have, went on in their lives. Then we have the psychological distress at cues, resembling events, and then we have the physiological reactions to cues resembling the events. The DSM-5 diagnosis criteria for PTSD cluster B: presence of greater than or equal to one of the following intrusive symptoms associated with the traumatic events beginning after the traumatic events occurred. So reoccurring involuntary and intrusive distressing memories of the event, like I mentioned before, the repetitive play, and I gave example of that, of the kind of we see, at the hospital. Also the reoccurring distressing dreams. So they may have some dreams, they may have frightening dreams without recognizable content. Dissociative reactions, flashbacks, which is similar to the one we talked about before, in which the individual sees, individual feels and acts as if the event were reoccurring. Psychological distress at cues resembling events, and physiological reactions to cues resembling events. DSM, the diagnostic criteria for cluster C. So here we have persistent avoidance of the stimuli associated with the traumatic events beginning after the traumatic events occurred. As evidence is greater than or equal to the following: avoidance or efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic event. See this a lot. Once again, my example at the hospital. When you're getting to know the kid may come in there, trying to open up to them, but they're actually avoiding conversations about it. Talking to them about, what happened. Why did they come to the hospital? And it's a traumatic event, actually, that gets them admitted to a hospital. Because a lot of people, most of the kids that come to the hospital that I work at, which is the psych department at Children's Hospital, come for aggression or suicidal ideations or just being unsafe at home. So that event that they got admitted to the hospital is a traumatic event. And so a lot of times they avoid it. They don't want to talk about why they got admitted to the hospital. They want to talk about their feelings, associated with, so we give them time, give them time to, trust us, and trying to give them time to see that they can open up to us, so that we can help them in that crisis, for the reason why they come. So that's a lot of avoidance that we see there initially too. Avoidance or efforts to avoid external reminders. So people, places, conversations, activities that arousing distressful memories, thoughts, or feelings about closely associated with traumatic event. Had an example here. Female came in, and she didn't want to deal with me. She didn't want to talk to me. And later on, we found out that she was avoiding me because I reminded her I looked like somebody that had abused her in the past, and so she was avoiding me because of the reminder of that person. So this is an example of the avoidance because efforts to avoid that person, and I reminded her of somebody that she didn't have a good relationship with. And so once we acknowledged that, I was able to give her that space and and not press the issue, but just actually give her space in dealing with her issues at the hospital. DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for cluster D, presence of greater than or equal to one of the following intrusion symptoms associated with the traumatic events beginning after the traumatic event occurs. We go the reoccurring involuntary and intrusive distressing memories. Once again, the repetitive play that we keep, that we go back to. That's the theme here. Also, the distressing dreams that we talked about before. Disassociated reactions, flashbacks, in which the individual feels or acts, trauma-specific reenactment may occur and play, which I gave an example in the psychological distress, at cues, resembling events, and the physiological reaction to cues resembling the event. Diagnostic criteria for cluster E is marked alterations in arousal and reactively associated with the traumatic events beginning or worsening after the traumatic event occurred, as evidence of two of the following: irritable behavior, and angry outbursts with little to no provocation, typically expressed as verbal or physical aggression. So with this irritability, we see a lot of kids, my example, where I work, I see a lot of these patients that I work with that are irritable, very angry outbursts over what seems to be nothing, what seems to be a little thing, but they just have a big, huge outburst. They could be sitting at the table and they spilt a little bit of their food or a little bit of their milk. They're saying, don't cry over spilled milk, but actually these kids will. It's little provocation. It's very irritable. They get very irritable, and it's just an outburst. They scream, yell, and they may even get physically aggressive over that little, or to sometimes even nothing may happen, and they just may have an outburst and just be irritable throughout the day. So these are some diagnoses for their reckless or self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance. So they're just really always on the lookout. They're just really just aware of their surroundings. It's hypervigilant. Exaggerated startle response. So example that I would have here, and I see a lot of these kids, we have maybe 8 to 10 patients on the unit. They all have their separate rooms. So a lot of times when they close their doors, it's not a slam, but it does make a little bit of noise. And you get some of the patients that are just startled, from the closing of the door, and it's exaggerated. So they may yell, or they may just scream or run towards you out of fear, because of the closing of the door, where the closing of the door wasn't really that loud, but it was an exaggerated startle response from that kid because of what they perceived to be louder to them, all caused by the PTSD, some things that they've been through. So here the diagnostic criteria for this dissociative subtype. So during the duration of disturbance of criteria B, C, D, and E is greater than 1 month. G, the disturbance causes clinically significant distress or impairment important areas of functioning. H here, the disturbance is not attributable to the psychological effects of the substance or other medical condition. So effects of the substance or other medical condition, or duration of the disturbance of criteria B, C, D, and E is greater than or equal to a month. DSM-5 diagnostic criteria for PTSD, dissociative subtype. So here is specify whether the individual's symptoms meet the criteria for PTSD. The individual experiences persistent or recurrent symptoms of either of the following: depersonalization, experiences of feeling detached from, and is one where an outside observer of one's mental process or body. So example is feeling as though one were in a dream, feeling a sense of unreality of self or body or time moving slowly. So here we have a lot, these kids here that come in for, they have PTSD, but then also have, suicidal ideations, they want to harm themselves coming to the hospital. And so I've even heard, some of the kids even say that they felt like they weren't there. They were in a dream, that they weren't really actually, alive. So these are some of the things that depersonalization that they're experiencing in that crisis. That's associated with, the disassociation. So they're disassociating with themselves in that crisis, in a sense. And a lot of times, even with the next one, the derealization, experiences of unreality of surroundings. Examples, the world around the individual is experienced as unreal, dreamlike, or distant, or distorted. So the world around the personal world around them, they may be experiencing that it's not real. We get these patients now, since over the last several months with the pandemic and the COVID-19, we have a lot of kids, adolescents coming in and just really dealing with it difficult. They're having a difficult time. So coming in the hospital to get treated for just different symptoms. And a lot of times they're saying that the virtual stuff in school and that they're dealing with, and the stuff that they're not being able to be around their friends, they just feel like this pandemic it takes a toll on our kids. It's taking a toll on adults too, but really on our children. So they're feeling like it's unreal. This is something that is unprecedented. We haven't been through ever, in this with the pandemic. So we're getting a lot of kids now that are disassociative now and feeling like this is not real. This is just a dream. Having those type of derealizations based upon what we're dealing with in our world today. So that's just kind of what I see now at the hospital. That's the UCLA PTSD Reaction Index. This is, here it talks about the six section of trauma history profile, the PTSD symptom scale, the frequency scale, distress and impairment in functioning, the PTSD Reaction Index score sheet. The trauma history profile section is used to assess history of exposure to a wide range of traumatic events. For each trauma marked yes on a trauma history profile, the trauma detail section is used to gather that additional information about specific details of the traumatic experience, whether the child or adolescent was a victim, witnessed, or learned about the trauma, and the ages over which the trauma occurred. So the PTSD symptom scale and the frequency rating scale are used to rate the number of days in the past month that the child or adolescent experienced each PTSD symptom. Then you have the distress and impairment in functioning section, which is used to rate whether the PTSD symptoms are related to the significant distress, problems, a relationship at home, school, with peers, and in development. The PTSD Reaction Index score sheet provides a method of calculating whether the DSM-5 criteria are met for PTSD symptoms. I just put a picture of a brain. Right here, this trauma affects the brain. We talk about the prefrontal cortex and the way of thinking. Trauma has a huge effect on the way we cognitively think, so it does affect the brain tremendously. What the kids do, I find, coming in that we see at the hospital, the decision making, they're not thinking straight. They may even go to the fight, flight, or freeze mode when they're in a crisis, all based on trauma. But the trauma history profile here, the clinician administer the trauma exposure screen, prompts clinicians to assess the age and features of exposure, utilizes all available sources of information, example, self-report, caregivers, other informants, completes an intake and updated over the course of the treatment. Here's an example of the PTSD symptom scale and the frequency rating scale that are used here. They rate the number of days in the past month that the child or adolescent has experienced each of the PTSD symptoms. So right here is some of the, you can see some of the questions that they ask, having upsetting thoughts or pictures about it that came into your head when you didn't want them to, and then you right here, there's the score on the right of the number of days in the past month. So we have the score on the right there, so to give you the frequency. So each of these, just different questions of feeling upset when you think about it or hear about the event, which is number 4. Just kind of going over a couple of these questions. So these are kind of interview, and this is what we have an interview process at the hospital as well about the frequency, how often they are thinking about the traumatic events that they kind of go through, and it gives us a snapshot about the kid and how often that they are experiencing these thoughts and these symptoms that are in their head. These are some of the questions. This is the questionnaire here. Rule 5.1 or 5.1 uses the calendar ratings sheet to assess and determination of the number of days in the past month that a symptom occurred. Rated 0. 0 is no days. So 1 little to 2 days during the past month. 2 is some 1 to 2 days. 3 is a lot, is as much, is 2 to 3 days. And 4 is almost every day. So if we look back at this scale here, that those are the numbers here for the scores that it's talking about. That is rating for. 1 being little, 4 being the most, almost every day. The distress and impairment of functioning section, whether the symptoms are clinically significant distress and problems in relationships at home. 5, the reaction index score sheet provides a method of calculating the DSM-5 criteria for PTSD. Dissociative subtypes are met. There's a question here. Right here, the widespread of prevalence of trauma, exposure, and associated risk for PTSD underscores the need for reliable and valid measures for youth. The UCLA PTSD Reaction Index for this is most widely used tool that assesses post-traumatic stress reactions and predict PTSD diagnostic status in trauma-exposed children and adolescents. In 2011, they released a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental health disorders, 5th edition of the DSM-5. Called for developmentally appropriate measures of PTSD that incorporates the DSM-5 related modifications while exhibiting sound psychometric properties, including reliability, validity, and utility. So this is the University of UCLA's. And their research on the UCLA PTSD Index. This is the research indicates that PTSD Index is internally consistent and reliable when used with college students. Additionally, the factor structure of the measurement is similar to adolescents. The PTSD Index seems to be an appropriate screener for PTSD symptoms among young adults. The findings tend to relevant for both the DSM-4 and DSM-5 screening measures, and the findings have both research and clinical implications. The findings are particularly important for longitudinal studies and are challenged with addressing the developmental progression of PTSD symptoms among participants. while also addressing changes in the PTSD. So we have here the R15 items are developed with the assistance of clinicians and researchers with expertise in assessing childhood traumatic stress with the aim of developing age-appropriate items that correspond with the DSM-5 PTSD symptom criteria. So we have here step 1, involve generating candidate R15 items, which include A, items taken verbatim from the DSM version, or B, reworded items from the DSM-4 version, and C, the new items designed to capture the DSM-5 PTSD symptoms, including the dissociative subtype, which we talked about the dissociative subtype earlier. It's the UCLA PTSD reaction index for the DSM-5. The UCLA PTSD reaction index for DSM-5 is a self-report questionnaire to screen exposure to traumatic events and assess PTSD symptoms in school-age children and adolescents. So that's the screen of the scale that we're talking about. The example that I showed you before with the frequency. But this is a questionnaire here. The scale assesses the frequency of occurrence of PTSD symptoms during the past month, rated 0, none of the time, or 4 for most of the time. So I reviewed that in the last couple slides there before, 1 being very little, like I mentioned before, and 4 being a lot more frequently. So just asking the child those questions, the questionnaire, trying to get a sense of what's going on, what they're thinking about. The items map directly into the DSM-5, intrusion avoidance, and arousal criteria, while 2 additional items assess associated features. So, associated feature there. In study 1, item response theory model identifies 11 most informative items across their relative subscales. R15 BF exhibits appropriate internal consistency in both studies. In study 2, the receiver operating characteristic analysis indicates that the R15 BF score of 21 maximized sensitivity and specificity. Moreover, diagnostic likelihood ratios across multiple levels of scores provide support for the measures clinical utility in identifying different levels of PTSD risk. So we have 2 studies there. These are methods. These are the methods. So in study 1, the methods that were used, they used the item response method to derive from the R15BF from the UCLA PTSD reaction index from the DSM-5 and assess its internal consistency using a sample of 486 trauma-exposed youth. So the mean average was about 13 years old. And recruited through a practice of research networks. So those were the methods. That's what the methods they used for the study, for the first study. Second study, they used receiver operating characteristics analysis and diagnostic efficiency statistics to assess the discriminant groups, validity, and clinical utility. For the R15 BF in identifying children at different levels of PTSD risk using a sample of 41 treatment-seeking youth. And so the average here with the 41 treatment-seeking youth, the average age was 12.4. So we have those 2 methods that were used for with the studies that we talked. So let's hit here. These are the references that I used in this presentation. There's a website, the UCLA PTSD Reaction Index. Is what I used for this presentation. Hope you guys enjoyed. Have a blessed day. Stay safe. And God bless. Thank you for listening. God bless.